Hi, my name is April, and this is High Fantasy Writing. Today, we're going to be continuing my little series on critiquing advice. And for this video, I'm actually going to take the other side of the equation. Most of my videos have been about you are the critique partner, how you should behave when you're critiquing other people's work. But today, we're going to take a look at the flip side and how to receive critiques if you are the one who is giving your manuscript over to somebody. They are writing all their critiques on it and handing it back to you. Now, this, you might not have thought about how you would respond to critiques, but it's a really good thing to think about before you start sending out your critiques, because the mindset that you take receiving the critiques is just as important as the mindset when giving critiques. Now, this is a very sensitive topic for a lot of people because we have created something as writers. We have put time and effort and our own personality into this thing that we are sending off for critiques. So it can be very, very terrifying to do that and to receive things that aren't glowing reviews back. It can be very difficult mentally to not take those critiques as an attack on yourself and just separate yourself from your work enough so that you can use those critiques to make your work even better rather than breaking you down and making you lose all confidence in your writing skills. So in honor of taking that leap of faith, putting your work out there and seeing how people respond to it, not knowing how people are going to receive it, I have worn one of my favorite shirts. What is the worst that could happen? This is from one of my favorite YouTube channels, D&D channels, the Dungeon Dudes. It's one of their live playthroughs of the D&D world. It's the campaign called Dungeons of Drakkenheim, and this is a quote that one of the characters, a half-elf shadow sorcerer named Sebastian Crow, says a whole bunch when they're about to leap into a dangerous situation that they know they need to do, but who knows how it's going to turn out. So he says, what's the worst that can happen, to kind of psych himself up and be like, you know what? We can do this. And that's kind of the attitude that I like to also have when sending my work out for critiques. What's the worst that could happen? They don't like your work. Okay, you can move on and find somebody else who might. Your work is not going to be for everybody, and people might critique it. People might negatively critique it in a very heavy manner, but that's okay. You took that leap, and you are slogging through it along with the rest of us who have sent our manuscripts out for critiques. Now, if you aren't mentally prepared to receive critiques on your work, that can be extremely damaging both to you and to your critique partner. You never want to lash out at a negative critique because you aren't prepared to internalize and kind of sort through any negative feedback you might receive. The knee-jerk reaction for a lot of us is to just deny comments that say that there's an issue with our story, or to attack the critiquer and say, well, you just didn't get my story. You just didn't get my characters. This is just my style of writing. Stop telling me that it's bad and unclear writing because it's just my style, so you just don't know what you're talking about. That is a completely normal internal reaction when you first begin to receive critiques back on your work. It's completely normal to have that knee-jerk, I need to defend this work that I have spent so much time and energy on. But what we need to make sure that we never, ever, ever do is let that become externalized and actually say those things to our critique partner. You never want to attack your critique partner even if they actually are just being a dick in their critique, even if they are giving you actually bad critiques, you never want to attack them as people. You can remove yourself respectfully from that situation rather than screaming and yelling at them and sending them 15 pages of why they're wrong about your story. Obviously, when you have gotten to the point where you are sending your work out for critiques, you are very proud of it. You feel that it is ready for eyes other than your own to see it. And so to receive feedback that's not all super glowing, they love it, they love the characters, they love the plot, maybe there's a few little tiny things that they're like, oh, you could freshen this up a bit or tighten this up a bit. Obviously, that's what we want to see when we're sending it out for critiques. However, that's not always going to be the case, and that's not always the best case. The best case isn't a whole bunch of people telling you that your work is perfect. The best case is them saying, this has fantastic foundations, but let's make it better and better and better. Now, hearing that about your story, that perhaps a character arc didn't land for a critique partner, or a plot hook just isn't interesting to them, or maybe the world building they didn't connect to, that can be extremely disheartening for us as writers, and it makes us want to defend our work rather than have to go back to the drawing board and put in months and months more effort into something that we really thought was about to be ready for the editors and then publication. As writers, we really do want to justify the amount of time and effort and care that we have put into writing. But you have asked for a critique. You do know that your story is not ready for publication and that it takes another person's eyes to make sure that it is truly the best story it can be, to catch plot holes that you as the author have not seen, and to catch any issues with character development, any issues with the world building that you might not be able to see because you're so close to it. So always remembering, you did ask for this. You asked for somebody to tell you what is wrong with your work. And that can help us take a step back and instead of attacking the critique partner, be able to receive that critique in a constructive manner. Changing your mindset when you go into reading your critiques can be really helpful in relieving those feelings of inadequacy that you feel when somebody tells you that your story needs a lot more work. It'll stop those feelings of anger at your critique partner, thinking that they just didn't get your genius. If a reader has negative feedback for your story or hypercritical feedback for your story, that doesn't mean that all the time and effort you put into your story was meaningless and useless and you just wasted your time. Everything that you have written so far is a stepping stone for the next revisions of your story. You have this experience under your belt. You have tried different things, different methods of stylization in your writing, different ways to describe your characters, perhaps the entire type of character that you have introduced. You've now tried that. You've now seen what it's like to write a character like that. And that's all good experience that you can carry on forward in the revisions and with your new projects. So none of the time that you have spent writing your story is ever wasted, even if a critique partner highlights a huge section of your book and says you need to rework all of this. As a writer, you need to acknowledge that you have asked somebody to critique your work. You have asked them to tell you what is not working and what you need to change and how they feel about your work. It is not fair to your critique partner to take out your anger and frustration and feelings of inadequacy on them, the person who you asked to tell them these things. You asked them to tell you what's wrong with your story. It is not fair for you then to attack them for doing just that. You need to have the tools to be able to handle your feelings of inadequacy and fear and frustration if somebody isn't responding to your story the way that you want them to. The most important rule for how to receive critiques is to not ever respond to your critique partner's comments the first day that you read them. You need to take time to be able to process what they've said and be able to work through those knee-jerk reactions of defensiveness and frustration and anger and thinking, oh, well, you just didn't get it. Take a breath, step back, and never let your critique partner see those knee-jerk reactions and inflammatory thoughts that you have before you've actually been able to process their critiques. Our gut reactions to criticisms are rarely pretty unless you have had a lot of experience receiving critiques. It does get easier with time. It does get easier to separate yourself from your work and to be able to actually see what your critique partner is commenting on rather than just thinking they're dumping on my story. They're telling me that I'm a terrible writer. It gets easier with time to be able to put those thoughts in the back seat and sometimes alleviate them altogether. But when you're first starting out, getting your critiques, it's completely normal to have those extreme reactions. And that's why taking a step back and not responding immediately is so important to getting the most out of your critiquing experience. You definitely do not want to attack your critique partner and completely shut the door on a great partnership that will maybe last for years and make your story even better and better and better because somebody else's eyes have been on it. Maybe somebody who has more experience than you, different experience with different genres and types of writing than you, anything, all of the above. Somebody else helping you is a great thing, and you don't want to attack your critique partner because you haven't taken the time to step back from the critique when you first receive it, therefore cutting off any possibility of continuing your partnership with them in the future. Here is my suggestion for when you receive a critique for the first time. Go ahead and read that critique. Then stop. Go do something else. Something completely different, not even related to your story. Go watch a YouTube video, a movie, go take a walk, go play with a pet, call a friend and ask them how their day has been, just anything to separate yourself from those initial feelings that you had when reading the criticisms of your work. Then think about the different comments that you remember them saying without rereading them yet. Just think about in your mind, what do I remember them saying? And this is a really important part because our memories can pick out things that they didn't actually say. We might remember their comments in a very different way than what they actually wrote. So that when you go back and actually reread them after some distance, you can think, oh, I thought that they were saying that this character was complete trash and that I needed to cut them from the story altogether, when in reality all they were really saying was this one scene that they're in, it doesn't really feel like they're integral to the scene, so maybe you can remove them from the scene, tighten up the dialogue, tighten up the cast of characters in this scene, and make it a lot stronger for it. I can almost guarantee that the comments that you thought were extremely harsh and cruel when you first read them, when you reread them, you realize that they were nowhere near as terrible or as insulting as you first read them to be. Getting some distance can really help you see what your critique partner is actually saying and see that most of the time they're not being mean with their critiques, or their intention is not to be mean with their critiques. Taking some time will also sometimes make the comments make more sense than they initially did. If you read the comment and were like, that makes no sense because you're so close to your story and you wanted to see them read your chapter and say, oh my gosh, this is an incredible scene. And if they didn't, you might be like, what? Your comments make no sense. You didn't even mention this really cool part of the scene that I spent a lot of time on. Getting some distance will sometimes help you to see the sense in what they have seen in your story rather than the story that you have built up in your mind. And a lot of times, with that distance, you can then reread their comment and then see issues in your manuscript that you had no idea were there. And of course, if we spent a lot of time and effort making the manuscript good enough to send off to critiquers, we don't want to see that we have missed a huge thing, a huge issue in our story. But taking some time, listening to what the other person has said, can actually help us find those issues in our story that we would have never caught without our critique partner. Some of the critiques or comments in the critiques are going to be complete trash. That's okay. If somebody has written a whole bunch of comments or a few comments that just don't make any sense, have nothing to do with your story, then it's okay to not respond to them. If the person says, I think that her hair should be blonde, not brown, it's a trash critique. It's not really a critique. If they just prefer blonde characters, that's not an issue with your writing. That's an issue with what they have chosen to critique about your work. It's okay to completely ignore those critiques if they're complete trash. You don't need to go to them and put their comment and say, this comment that you have made is complete trash and here's why. You can just ignore it. Just ignore the comment, do not respond to it, and pick and choose the actual better comments that they had to then respond to those. So when you respond, number one, always thank them for the critique. They have taken time out of their day to read through your manuscript and think about it and write comments about it to try and help you make your story better. You are most likely not even paying them for this service, so always thank them for taking the time to do this favor for you, because it is a favor that they're doing that they are really expecting nothing in return unless you are doing an exchange. And even if you're doing an exchange, still thank them because they've spent time and effort and have possibly lost money to do this for you. After you have thanked them for critiquing your work, then you can address some of the comments that they have made. Perhaps you should express excitement if they caught a little nuanced thing that you had put in your writing that you weren't quite sure if it was going to land. If you thought maybe it was too vague of a comment, if you thought it might have been too small of a detail for people to pick up on. If your critique partner has picked up on it and commented on it, thank them for that. Let them know that you appreciate how closely that they were reading your work and how you have relieved some of their fears on, did I do too much in this foreshadowing? Did I not do enough? Knowing that their critique partner has picked up on it and letting that critique partner know will let the critique partner know that they're doing a good job. It'll let them know that you appreciate their time, you appreciate how detailed they're being, and they're more likely to pay more attention to your story going forward as well. In this section, you can now start to answer any specific questions that your critique partner has asked of you that they clearly want answered right now. So perhaps they have forgotten the age of your main character, and they feel like it would really help if they actually knew the age of your main character so that they could then rate them and critique your main character more accurately based on their age in the story. Perhaps they want a refresher of what is the relationship between two characters. If they can't remember if two characters are related, but they kind of think they are, you can let them know little details about your story, specific questions answered, if that was the critiquer's goal. If the critique partner is just asking like rhetorical questions or suggesting some possible theories that they think about in the future, you don't need to address those unless they've kind of specifically asked you to, but then you can just be like, hey, I'd rather let the story unfold for you rather than telling you all the little plot twists. But this is the point in your response to the critique to go ahead and answer some questions they might have. So now, after you have buttered up your critique partner, thanked them for the critique, complimented them on how great of a critique partner they are, answered some of their questions, now you can begin to address some of the comments that you disagree with or have issues with. So really only do this if their misunderstanding is fundamentally impacting the way that they see your story or understand your story. In the example before, you can gently remind them that you did introduce this character as a guard on duty, so it does make sense that they would be in armor. And yes, it is convenient that there was an issue and they were there in armor to stop the issue because that's their job as a guard. Now you should say this nicely, kindly, gently, perhaps throw in a few things like maybe I should make it more clear, sprinkle in a few more descriptions about how his boots are clanking as he's walking down the hallway, how he's fingering his sword when he sees somebody who might be suspicious, talking to fellow guards about which rounds they're doing, something like that, to make sure that you understand that he is a guard and don't forget that. Obviously, that was a terrible way to phrase it, but kind of gently being like, oh yeah, maybe that wasn't super clear, but I did say he was a guard. Usually letting them know that or gently reminding them that yes, I did address this in the story, so it's not an issue actually. Usually they're super apologetic and they're like, oh my god, I completely missed that. I guess I just read it too fast and glossed over that part. Sorry about that. Because when reading something, especially for the first time, you're gonna miss stuff. Everybody does. So being gentle if they have misunderstood something in your story that's kind of fundamental to understanding your story, clarifying that for them, gently showing them that, hey, I did do that, so you commented that you didn't understand this thing, but I did explain it, so do you think I should explain it more? Because then you get into the scary issue of, oh, readers think that you're spoon-feeding the story to them because you're over-explaining things, and that's a whole mess that you don't want to get into. So hopefully, when you address it with your critique partner, they will say, oh, so sorry that I misunderstood that. Or perhaps they'll say, yeah, you do need to kind of reiterate that a little bit more in the story in whatever way you feel is most natural to add into your story. It's all part of the process. It's all part of the critiquing process, seeing how other people respond to your story, you responding back, either confirming what they have said or saying, hey, this is actually how it was, and then them responding back saying either. Perfect. That explains everything. I see now in your text how that actually was a thing that you brought up, or them saying, hey, you actually do need to clarify that a bit more, and then that's a growing experience. You're making your story better. It's what it's all about. Now, if you get the critique back, you have read through the critique, you have taken a break, you have stepped back from it, you have gone and done something else, you have spent many hours or perhaps overnight thinking about the comments and then not thinking about the comments, and then come back to the critique, and it is still awful and rude and unhelpful to you making your story better. If you have determined through your own sensibilities, or sometimes you can send it to a friend and be like, hey, am I going crazy? Like, am I just being too sensitive, or is this person just being a dick? Sometimes they're just being a dick. And it is absolutely okay for you to kick them to the curb and be like, hey, that's not the type of interaction that I want to have when it comes to my story. Do it as politely as possible. You don't really want to burn too many bridges, and it's just, even if they're awful, even if they're so rude and rude about your story, rude about your writing, like if somebody responds to you and you are not a third grader and they say, this reads like a third grader who failed second grade English wrote this. Yeah, you can kick them to the curb and say, hey, thank you for critiquing the work, but I don't think that our styles mesh. I don't think that you're a good fit for my story. Any vague, generic, thank you, but we're gonna part ways now, is absolutely okay. You do not have to stay with a critique partner who is actually shitting on your work. I know I have had to step away from stories that just weren't good fits for me. It wasn't that the person was a particularly bad writer or it was a bad story. It was just that the story that they set out to tell was not one that resonated with me, sometimes was not one that I was comfortable reading. I personally do not enjoy stories that feature child abuse. This one person who I had to step away from their story, they were writing from the first person of a very young child who experienced a lot of abuse, physically, mentally, and sexually, in the story. And that was kind of the focus of a lot of the story. And I just had to let them know, I'm so sorry. I see that what you're saying here is very important, but I am not the person to read this story. It's not something that I feel comfortable reading, and it's not something that I feel I can give critique on. And that's completely okay. Every story is not going to be for every person. Every person isn't going to have the skill set to be able to critique a story. So it's okay to step back, or if you receive a critique back and it's clear that they're just not equipped to critique your specific story, that's okay. It's okay to politely and cordially split ways and say thank you for your time, but the story isn't a good fit for me, it's not a good fit for you, or the critiquing style just doesn't mesh. It's absolutely okay. Finding the right fit for a critique partner can be incredibly difficult. I have gone through so many people reading like my first 3 chapters, usually just my first chapter. They read it, they say it's great, they give critique, and then they completely ghost me. And I never hear from them again. That's normal. After all, especially if you're not paying people for the work, or if they're not seasoned critique partners, or if they have like a family, a job, your critiquing your work is not always going to be their first priority, and that's okay. But you still want it critiqued, so just keep going at it, keep talking to new people, keep sending your work out there to be critiqued. I suggest only sending the first chapter, so a whole bunch of completed manuscripts of your work aren't just floating around out there, and it makes it a lot more digestible for someone just getting into your story. But it took me a long time, months, possibly a year. I would have to go back and check the dates. it took a long time sending my work out to different critique partners and having them ghost me before I found one that, number one, didn't ghost me, and number two, was giving me really great feedback that was constructive but also critical and showing me things about my story that I had never seen before. So they are out there. Great critique partners are there, but it does take a lot of time, and it's completely okay that if you receive your critique back, it's not the greatest. You can part ways politely until you find the person who fits with your style of work. That is my advice for when you are the person receiving a critique on your manuscript, how to receive it and be constructive in your responses, in internalizing this critique, all of that sort of thing. Because it can be very, very nerve-wracking and terrifying, and it can make you feel really inadequate as a writer when you're receiving critique that says, hey, you need to rework this, hey, this doesn't make sense, hey, whatever negative thing they have to say about your work. But critiquing is a very important part of the writing process, of making sure that your story is ready for publication and ready for people to read the story and get something out of it. You don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on a story and think people are going to respond to it in a certain way, think that you have nailed themes or mood or characters, only to find out that you have spent all this money on editors and publishing, and people read your story and it did not land the way you thought it was going to land. Critique partners are so invaluable in helping you truly make your story the story that you want to put out there. I hope that this video was very useful to you, maybe alleviated some fears or worries that you had about getting critiques back. Perhaps you have already received a couple of critiques back and you had no idea how to handle the negative feedback on your work, but you know that there is a way to healthily deal with negative feedback. Hopefully you found this video and that it was helpful and it gave you a couple of tools that you can use so that you can get the most out of your critique partnering experience. After all, it's terrifying, but what's the worst that could happen? My name is April, this is High Fantasy Writing, and I hope you really enjoyed, and I am super excited about a couple of the videos that I already have planned out to come out next on the channel. I have a couple of videos where I'm branching out from just writing advice and critiquing advice. Well, they sort of are also still writing advice. So I'm going to go over the TV show on Netflix, Shadow and Bone, about how I feel the Netflix show, things that they did much better than the books were able to do, which can also help you as a writer when you're writing to see, oh, okay, here's how the books are. Here's something that I can see on TV, a different type of writing, and I can see how I can merge those two into my own book. So I'm super excited about that. And I also want to talk about season 2 of Shadow and Bone, which I think has sort of a little bit rumored to have been picked up by Netflix. I really hope it has because it did really, really well, and I think that the way they incorporated Shadow and Bone and the cast of Six of Crows was really, really great, and there's so much to go forward from. Obviously, there are 2 more books in the trilogy of Shadow and Bone, so there's a lot of stuff that I'm really looking forward to see. And I have a video talking about what I would like to see from a very specific character that is going to be, would be introduced in the next season if they follow the second book of the Grisha verse trilogy of Shadow and Bone. Okay, that was rambling. But I really do hope that you stick around for that because I'm really excited about those, kind of branching out a little bit into more pop culture-y rather than just vague theoretical advice. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day. Go ahead and check out the Dungeon Dudes if you are sort of into D&D or just like storytelling. Their Dungeons of Drakkenheim season is complete. It is a 52 episode season of just a group of friends getting together and telling stories on the fly, creating stories, creating characters, fleshing out those characters, and it's actually pretty great. Looking at it from a writer's perspective, it's nothing like writing a novel, but it's a great itch to scratch if you're looking for unique storytelling where you really get to insert yourself as the characters. Anyways, I hope your day is fantastic and happy writing. Bye-bye!